computer. Okay. Okay, I think that we can start now. It's a good place. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I think that at least for the first event of the student section this year, which is the graduate school panel, my name is Maria Jose Romero Jimenez. I am from Costa Rica. I'm also a grad student. I'm also the vice chair of the Mycological Society of America student and postdoc section. Today, we're joined with a great lineup of panelists that will, talk to us about applying to grad school, what it's like to be a graduate student, and a little bit more. And those include Susan, Terry, Jeff, Paris, and Elena. And just to give you like an idea of what the activity will be today, after their introductions, we'll have a couple of questions of what a regular panel looks like. And after that, we'll have a 5-minute break. And then after that, we are going to have breakout rooms that are of different topics, and that way you'll have the opportunity to ask your questions and then just be part of the conversation with the panelists, and that'll be for about 45 minutes. And I think that that's kind of it. So Susan, if you would like to start with the introductions.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Egbert. Pronouns are she, her, and I am a third-year PhD student at the University of Manitoba. And really, I'm studying lichen secondary metabolites. So yeah, that's really all about me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Terry Torres. I am an international student from Costa Rica. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate in plant pathology at Penn State, and I work in Dave Kaiser's lab, so a lot of my work has to do with Fusarium. I did a master's before my PhD, and I also worked in between my master's and PhD, so if there are questions related to that, or if you're deciding whether to do a master's or if you want to go straight into a PhD, happy to answer questions about that. And I'm also involved in like a lot of different advocacy work around the university in terms of like mental health and diversity and other issues. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer those as well.
All right, I think I'm next. So hi everyone, my name is Jeff Stallman. My pronouns are he, him, and I am in Kathy Ames' lab at Purdue University. Before this, I got my master's degree at the University of Hawaii, Hilo. And I'm interested in tropical fungal biodiversity, macrofungi, biogeography, things like that. And maybe kind of similar to Terry, my undergrad was in the liberal arts, and I worked for many years before getting my master's and my PhD. So also kind of a non-traditional background, if you want to chat about that.
I'll go next. Paris, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. My name is Paris, and my pronouns are she, her. I got my undergraduate degree in biology and was on the track to going to med school, but research really changed my mind. So I did a master's to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. And then I'm finishing off my PhD at the University of New Mexico with Donald Natvig. And I study human and animal fungal pathogens, and specifically right now I'm studying valley fever. I'm identify as LGBTQ+, and I'm getting married, so lots of things going on during my degree if you want to chat about that, or applying to different kind of grad programs.
Hey, so I'm Elena. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a 4th year, I guess that just started since the semester started. I'm now a 4th-year PhD candidate, which is stressful, at the University of Florida in the plant pathology department. And I am co-advised by Dr. Matthew Smith and Dr. Amina Ghazi. So I'm currently located at a field station down in Homestead, Florida, which is like the last town before the Keys. And I study ectomycorrhizal fungi associated to a critically endangered ecosystem. I don't have a master's degree. I graduated from Smith College, which is also a small liberal arts school. And then I was actually the manager of the AIM lab for 2 years. So I was at Purdue, and then I started my degree. So I can also talk a little bit about non-master's track, working after school, mental health, really anything.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So we can start with the first question. And to the attendees, like, feel free, if you have any questions, feel free to send them on the chat, and we'll read them out loud for the panelists. So to start, the first question is like, what really is a grad student, and what do grad students do? So would someone like to start with that one? Okay. Terry, would you like to start?
Sure.
Awesome.
What is a grad student? I guess it's a person that's either pursuing a master's or a PhD. What do we do? A lot of us do research, and sometimes depending on the type of appointment that you have, or where your funding is coming from, you might be doing different things. So you might be working on a specific project because you're on a certain grant. You might just be a research assistant, which means you just get to be in the lab the whole time. Or you might be a teaching assistant. So you might have to like teach, and there are various degrees of what teaching means when you're a TA as well. But if your funding is coming from that side, then you will have to teach as well. Yeah. Does anyone else want to add something?
Just to add to what Terry said, there is also thesis and non-thesis route. Generally, if you're doing research or are heavy in research, your advisor will either expect/help you to do a thesis, or if you're pursuing a PhD, you might have to do several chapters for a dissertation. But there's also masters that you can receive that are non-thesis route, that are solely based on taking a number of courses, core and elective. So there are multiple options in graduate school that you want to consider as well.
I would also add that the structure of grad school kind of changes. So in most programs, at least for PhD, you usually start with approximately the first 2 years, you're taking classes and starting to build, kind of your idea for your dissertation. Depending on how many classes you have in the program, you might be doing more or less research. I didn't have a master's, so I had to take quite a bit of coursework. So I would say my first 2 years were very heavily, like I felt kind of like an undergrad taking, harder classes. And then once you pass your qualifying exam, you kind of shift a lot more to research. And then, in that case, you don't feel as much like a student. You really feel like a scientist just doing your work. Again, with TAing or doing research in other labs for pay is kind of dependent on the program.
I could say just coming in from Canada, or at least an American coming in from Canada, it's definitely structured differently, because during pharmacy school, I was kind of watching some of the pharmacy grad students, and it's totally different up here. I know, like, I think my degree really only required like 4 classes, but again, that varies from institution to institution. And like, especially as an international student, like they were kind of like recommending us to be in the master's route first before actually like switching over to a PhD. So there's also that to kind of consider. But if you want to be an American in Canada, it's definitely doable.
I guess I can just chime in that there's often a stereotype that, a scientist is like a solo person, like alone in their lab or at the computer. But as a graduate student, you are doing a lot of person-to-person interaction. And even if you don't need to teach for your funding, you're going to be mentoring other students in the lab as you become more advanced, and you're going to be working with your PI, but also just more advanced graduate students, with postdocs, collaborating with people at other locations. So having those communication skills and just knowing that that's, you know, a decent part of your program. It can vary depending on the program, but you'll be interacting with people a lot.
Thank you so much for your input. I think that that's kind of like really describes what a grad student is, and there's still so much more to that. So the second question, it's a little bit more personal. Why did you decide to go into grad school? Like, what were the things that kind of encouraged you to pursue that?
I can start on that one.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, so after receiving my master's, I worked as a technician and I quite enjoyed that work. But in the end, I just decided I wanted to study what I wanted to study, which in my case was I wanted to study Hawaiian mushrooms, which is a little particular and random, but I knew with just a master's degree, it was a lot more challenging to get funding for that and write grants for that myself, especially if I couldn't find someone with, you know, that terminal degree, a PhD, who could write those and I could be on that as well. So essentially, I decided to do it so I could try to direct my own research. I think that can be useful to have an end goal in mind and also to be flexible. So while that's what I want to do, I realize that a PhD is a long program. So my priorities might change, and the ability to get a job where I can set that research agenda is definitely not guaranteed.
I guess I can continue on the non-traditional route. So really kind of so like I was going through pharmacy school and I was like dead set on going to be like a hospital pharmacist. But then I had an internship at one hospital in where I was at, and it was a really toxic environment. So that really made me kind of reconsider life choices. And by like my second year of pharmacy school, like I was already in the lab for a couple years because I was doing like an honors program before I got in. And so after investigating, I was like, okay, let's do a PhD. Like there's MD PhDs out there. Why not be a PharmD PhD? So that's what got me to go to grad school.
I guess I went on like a normal route. If you say undergraduate, master's, PhD is like the basic, although it used to be, even 5 years ago, most people didn't get master's in route. It seemed like a lot of people just went from undergrad to PhD. But when I was an undergrad, I particularly wanted to do medicine, and I knew that. And I thought I was going to apply directly to medical school. And I had done an honors undergrad thesis. And so that had gotten me into a research lab, and those research opportunities are so helpful. And so my plan B ended up being getting my master's, because med school wasn't really working out for me and I wasn't in exactly the right mental headspace for it. And so I really loved my advisor and I liked the research I was doing. And so I started doing my master's, and I think I learned so much about how to conduct research and how to write, which became really important skills. And I thought, I'm going to do medical fungal research. And I wanted to, and like Jeff said, I wanted to kind of devise my own research plan and my own agenda. And to do that and to write grants and to have that autonomy, I knew that the next step in my career was to get a PhD. So I applied to PhD programs, and that's what I'm currently doing. But also, I also recognize that sometimes a master's degree is terminal for what you want to do. So recognizing the difference between what a PhD means and what it can do for your career versus what a master's means and what it can do for your career, because definitely what job you want to go into will help you determine what degree you should go for.
I really agree with Paris on that. That's actually what I was going to say. But I really think deciding whether you want to do grad school or whether you want to go for a master's or PhD, it involves a lot of knowing what you want for yourself and what makes you happy. So something that I realized that I really like doing was research, and I wanted to continue that. And then I think visualizing or like thinking about where you see yourself later on, what do you want to do for the rest of your life or for a part of your life? And then thinking, okay, I want X kind of position. Do I need a master's for that? Do I need a PhD for that? If you don't need either, you don't need to do it. And then if you do, then you go for it. And I think that's how I decided on doing like the different steps that I've done, just thinking of like where I wanted to get and what I needed to do to get there.
Yeah, I feel like everyone has said, you know, all the things. I think for me, I always was really in love with science and learning. Like I just love to learn, and I really was drawn to the idea of like pushing knowledge beyond like what you could learn in a classroom, and saw myself as a scientist, like, oh, I can actually learn the things that we don't actually know yet. And I think for me, I felt like in order to get to that career level where you're really driving your own research, you know, you're really seen as a scientist, the training of the PhD kind of made the most amount of sense, because again, I feel like I want that autonomy of like writing grants, designing my own research program, or, you know, being a scientist at a larger company. And so I kind of just went down the route of like, kind of the values that I want in my career require the PhD. So it wasn't like I had a particular, like, I want to be a professor, and so I'm going to get my PhD, but it was more like the level of science that I want to do and the types of jobs that I want to do are going to need me to do a PhD. So that's kind of how I got into it.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. We had one question, and it's about the criteria that you use to decide to how many programs you end up applying. So yeah, it's basically that. How do you know how many programs you need to apply, and then how do you know which program to apply to?
I guess I can start off. So I applied to 5 programs, and really for me, what kind of drove me to apply to these programs were kind of like, some of them were just because my prof that I was researching under was kind of like encouraging me to apply to those universities because they're more well known. But there was also like the place where I'm at right now. I actually applied to this one kind of at the end, but it was after talking to my boss that kind of like solidified the deal really for me. So I think it's really up to what interests you, and like, do you actually see yourself in that geography? Because for me, I didn't really mind going to somewhere completely new. But some people do have that obligation to stay within a certain region. So kind of be considerate of like what your life entails for you.
Kind of to go off what Susan said. So I think I'm going to pull in Hannah's question as well, which asked about differences and opportunities between masters and PhDs in this. So when I went from my undergraduate to master's, I applied to one program, which is a little risky, but I already knew the advisor and I had already been working for the advisor. And so it was easier for me to just kind of track my way into that. When I applied to PhD programs, I got the advice that I should apply to around 3. And the reason was that interviews and writing those applications take time. And if you're going to go to interviews, you're going to be there a couple of days and you're going to just take time out of your semester to do so. And so also depending on your flexibility and your schedule, you have to do that. So I applied to 3 programs and got to 2. And where I found those advertised, one of them was on the MSA website. So you can sometimes find where PIs are looking for master's or PhD students. Now I actually, from the advice from someone in MSA, have a Twitter, and my scientific Twitter also shares a lot of information for where there are master's, PhDs, and postdoc opportunities. And then additionally, networking can be essential. So, kind of the more involved you get, I know it's been harder without being in person, and that's where you get networking. But if you can shoot out emails or connect with students or PIs, they can connect you to people. And then you can find out more about that program, what research is there, what the opportunity means. Are you comfortable living in that geography? And like Susan said, that factor has become more and more important thing to me as you kind of continue into life and want to stay more maybe transplanted. What makes you happy, what makes you feel healthy as well are factors that go into you thinking about these opportunities.
Yeah, it's a little bit different than undergrad, where usually with undergrad you kind of apply to an array of schools. You kind of have your reach schools, your schools you're pretty sure you would get into, and your safety schools, and that's usually based on your GPA and your what is the test they take, the SATs or the ACTs. I don't know, maybe those are gone now, I don't know. But in grad school it's a little bit different, where you're really looking for an advisor and a lab and a program that has money for you, and is taking new students. And of course, based on your GPA and other factors, there may be programs that are a little bit more for as a reach, that maybe it's a very competitive program, and usually the department you're applying to can be very competitive depending on its rankings. But more than anything else, it's more about finding the advisor and the relationship, because as long as you have the basic credentials to get into the program, it really comes down to whether the advisor wants you and has money for you, way more than are you good enough in the way that it is with undergrad. And so if you kind of apply to programs without having that networking, without talking to the professor, and you're just kind of applying blindly, it can be very difficult. But again, it's grad school is very weird in that it's a little bit less I'm going to go to Harvard and, that's the goal. Harvard may not be the best program for what you're wanting to do. It could be the University of blah, blah, blah is the best place. So I think, move away from titles and status if that's been a driving force up until now.
Yeah, I would say for me, it was all about personal connections, and I was fortunate in that I was working beforehand, but those connections can be really useful in telling you, or essentially giving you feedback on what people have heard about other labs and professors to work with, or who's looking for graduate students. And when you get that feedback, that I would say increases the chances of your application, having those personal connections and being able to look into it a bit beforehand. But I wanted to go to Hannah's question as well, and other people may have differences of opinion on this, but I think for me, depending on your career path, a master's in purely a research field, usually I see that as kind of ending up at a technician level, where you'll be doing research, perhaps working with really complicated things, and depending on who your boss is, you might be involved in the research and the writing and the fieldwork and the lab work and all aspects of it, but you're not setting the research agenda. You may still even be helping write grants, but you're not really deciding what those grant topics are about. And with a master's, you may reach kind of the top level in a non-research path. So maybe management, if you're interested in working for the Forest Service or something like that, managing an area, you could get a job with a master's degree and kind of work your way up, because they might not require a PhD for kind of that head position. But in research-based positions, to be writing grants for research, not just to take care of an area like management, you'll want a PhD.
Terry can probably touch on this some, because I believe she worked for the USGS. But when you have your master's and you get a foothold in some of these agencies, I've heard, this is from other people working in some of the agencies, that it's really beneficial, because you also have to consider what job you want, because sometimes a PhD makes you almost overly qualified for some of those positions. Like if you want a management position or that kind of level where you're not necessarily having the burden of deciding what you're researching on or the burden of bringing in funds to supply whatever research management or investigation that you're doing. And I've heard that also a master's level education is really good to get in either the Forest Service or USGS or some of those levels too, because they also promote promotions within their agencies. So that's something to consider too. And there's lots of information on the web about some of those agencies if you're interested.
That is a good point, Paris. And I would just say it depends on geography as well. So I was a former technician with USGS, and at our field station, which was relatively small, there were no permanent positions for master's degree technicians. But if you move to some of the larger offices, there are. And on Hawaii Island at USDA, for example, there's permanent master's technician positions. So it's something to keep in mind. The agencies differ as well as locations differ depending on the size of the offices.
Yes, going back to the other question. In my case, so just like Paris, we actually did our master's at the same lab. So like I had a research assistantship offered to me before I applied to the program. So I just went with that one. For the PhD, I didn't pick like a program that I wanted to do. I just picked the fields and I picked mycology. So that's pretty broad. And from there, I just picked cool mycologists that I wanted to work with. And I went with that. And then something else that I had to take into account is as an international student, there are added costs to applying to grad school, especially if you're not from a country whose first language is English. So you have to get the TOEFL, you have to wait for the GRE if you need it for your program. Hopefully you don't. And then each school you apply to, you have to pay. And some of us don't come from that kind of background where you can just apply everywhere you want. So I ended up applying, so I picked 6 people in whose labs I wanted to be in. And I applied to those 6 programs and I got offers from 3 of them. So it's, and something that Elena mentioned, and I think Paris as well, is it's important to network and to meet the people and talk to them before you even apply to the program, because if not, it might not even make it through like the initial check. And where I ended up and the lab that I picked, and I guess the 2 of the 3 places that I got offers at were people that I had met at an MSA meeting. So take advantage of those meetings.
I would say also to kind of reference back to Hannah's question, if you're a bachelor student and you're kind of wondering like what degree to search for or like what kind of jobs you want to get, you can also email those like people in those positions too. Like the reason why I was kind of like pushing towards a PhD was because I kind of asked like NIH, the complementary division. I was like, hey, I'm a PharmD and I want to do lab work. Can I just do that with a PharmD? And they were like, no. So I would say don't hesitate to also like even cold email or even like ask on social media, like, hey, what does your job look like and how did you get there?
Yeah, and I would just say one of the things I think is really great about mycology is there are a lot of academic and like community science partnerships. So if you're interested in mushrooms, for example, obviously all my examples come from mushrooms because that's what I'm interested in. You know, you could be volunteering for some of these like larger community science efforts like the Fungal Diversity Survey, or there's often, you know, regional forays or the North American foray. And although it's not going to be full of academic mycologists, usually there will be some there, particularly from local universities. That's a good chance to reach out and meet some people there as well.
Awesome. So we had another question about How do competitions for jobs vary between those with a master's or a PhD?
I feel like this is kind of a hard question to answer, really, because it's more so about where do you want to go per se, rather than how like, does that make sense? Like, so I guess, for example, I'm in the chemistry department, so I think for some industry positions, they do prefer masters over PhD because they find PhDs to be a little bit overqualified and they have to pay them a little bit more. But if you're hoping to become like a prof, then yeah, they would definitely prefer a PhD over a master's. So it's I would need a bit more context per se.
I can add a little bit at least. So I read a job listing the other day for a professor in academia, and it said that it required a PhD and 2 years minimum of postdoc work. And my advisor, Don, is 68, and he told me when he got hired, he had one publication from his PhD and got hired as a geneticist. So that was like 40 years ago, nearly. And then my master's advisor, that's probably 20 years ago. When she applied, she had her PhD and 1 year of postdoc. And it didn't used to be on the application that you had to have a postdoc. There were people who got their PhD and then sometimes even got a professor job. And then now 2 years minimum of postdoc, and so we just did 3 new hires at our university, and some of them had 4 or 5 years of postdoc. So if you're thinking of academia, those jobs are becoming more and more competitive and they do require a PhD. However, if you want to work at a community college and you want to teach, maybe you only need a master's for some of their positions. And then, I mean, like I said earlier, the National Park Services, the National Forest Service, some of those other entities, or even the NIH or CDC, depending on what level you want to go into, a master's may be sufficient, and some of them may be extremely competitive, and some of those calls maybe not. So, you got to think of what you want to do. And then I encourage you to go for it. Even if you're sometimes minimally qualified, you should be able to flex your resume a little bit. Because we're mycologists, and I don't know how many calls there will ever be or job listings for a mycologist, but I am a medical mycologist. I'm a disease ecologist. I'm a biologist. I'm a computational biologist. You should be able to flex your skills to kind of fit in different job descriptions, and that may help you be more competitive for those positions.
Yeah, it's funny, when I was applying to grad school, I also heard some jobs you're overqualified. And I remember, even to this day, I'm about to graduate and I'm still like, oh my God, what if I'm overqualified for everything? And also I think I'm underqualified in everything. But I think that I agree that the job market can be quite tough right now. But I also think that there's a way that you can sell the types of skills that you've gotten in your PhD. And if it is a position that only is asking for a master's degree, I think if you can sell what you bring to the table that is unique, and there's a lot of skills that I think you pick up in your PhD that are unique to doing a PhD more so than doing a master's. And I think that it's all about how you sell yourself. I don't know, I have not gone onto the job market yet, so I could be incorrect, but I just remember that's something I've thought about since I heard the whole overqualification thing. And I'm like, I don't know if I believe that. I think there are a lot of skills that you earn in your PhD that are beyond just I did my PhD and I wrote a dissertation. I think there's a lot of soft skills and other skills that can be transferred into journalism or science communication or I don't know, I can't think of anything else right now, but there are other jobs other than being a professor and being a research scientist.
Cool. I think that we can go to the question that just popped up. That is, what does the day-to-day look like in your PhD or master's? So yeah, what's your experiences so far? Like what does a normal look day, and then what does a weird day looks like too?
I think there's a lot that happens in the day. Sometimes not a lot. So it's very like flexible on the amount of things that you might be doing and where you're at on different things. So like I'll just say like today for me, I got to the office at 7:30 in the morning. I had to put together permit proposal so that I can do my field research this December. So I worked for like 2 hours on that. Then I moved on to some writing different type of writing that I have to get done for a manuscript that I'm getting together that I need to send some of the co-authors in the evening. Then I had a really quick lunch, and in the afternoon, I had to TA for 4.5 hours. And after that, I went back to like analyzing some data, running to the lab to check on some cultures, and then I ran home. So, because I had to be in this meeting. And there's a lot. So like you might have TAing or teaching duties. There's your research, and your research has a lot of different components as well. So there's lab, there's writing, there's grants that you might need to write or awards that you need to apply to. Yeah, so the day-to-day varies a lot, just depending on when in the year you're at. And I'm not taking classes anymore, so I got that out of my to-do list, but at some point you will have to do that as well, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm taking down an experiment right now, so I spent all day looking at root tips under a microscope. But yeah, I've finished with classes. I've fulfilled all my teaching assistant duties. And since I'm at a field station, I'm a little bit separate from kind of main campus. My lab, my boss here runs the plant disease clinic here. So sometimes I have to help out if someone's out sick, like running the plant disease clinic, which is like a service to like real people in the world that come in with their sick plants. But yeah, the day-to-day can really change between like writing permit applications, like you said, working on journal article, like manuscripts that you're working on publishing, data analysis, field work. You're kind of, most grad students are kind of managing their own schedule. So unless maybe you have a really strict boss, it's kind of like how you work best and when you work best. And I have found that most labs are pretty laid back in terms of like what your hours are and how you work is kind of up to you. Like I've been in some labs that like I don't see people until 10:30 a.m. and I've been in labs that like people are there at 8 a.m. you know, so it's very different lab to lab.
Yeah, I think I would just echo that it's variable, and if your schedule is important to you, because for whatever reason, like, you know, if you have children and you need to work 8 to 5 every day because that's what it is, or you're caring for an elderly person, or you just want a schedule that's more flexible, and as long as you get the work done, you know, you can go take a nap in the afternoon if you don't have to TA or work with an undergraduate or something, then you just ask that to the PI before, you know, deciding you're going to work with them. You know, are there set hours I'm going to be in the lab? If I'm obviously don't have other responsibilities, or is it pretty flexible? Because that can be useful to know.
I can say that COVID's really affected my schedule. So right now where I'm at in Canada, we've been running at like about 40% capacity since I want to say last August now, but so yeah, like I've been spending a lot more time home because I'm doing a lot of bioinformatics work, but right now I'm kind of doing mass spec and then I'm going into a bit of molecular biology. But since the mass spec is kind of used by the whole entire department, I'm kind of doing more remote access after business hours just because I know that time is good for me. And the technician that works on that instrument knows that I'm usually kind of doing it at off business hours. So, yeah.
It sounds like we all agree that working on your graduate program is different in that you can figure out what time works for you and when you need things, and then you take care of business. So in this, there's also a little bit of accountability and responsibility on you as a student to get things done, to be productive. Sometimes your advisor may have you meet every week, every other week. My advisor, never, or whenever I want to, right? So it depends. You should talk about that relationship with them when you come. And then my daily schedule is very variable, like everyone else. I have done a TA every semester for my whole time here because when I got into my graduate program, I was told that I would have funding for that through the department. And then my advisor hasn't been able to bring funds, and I didn't bring funds in for myself either. I don't know. I think there is a question that we'll talk about later about funding for grad school. So we'll talk about probably the GRFP, but those things. So this morning I taught for 3 hours and then I'm watching a friend's dog. So I left and walked a dog, and that was a nice mental break for me. And I came back and I worked on a manuscript because I'm a little bit later in my graduate career. So I'm at the writing stage. And then I toggled with R for a long time trying to troubleshoot things. So that literally can be a whole day for some people during their graduate program. So you see, there are all these different like factors of things that you do, but an important thing is really keeping yourself organized and on track. And then working on things when's best for you within reason and within what works for your lab as well.
I would bring up the fact that when you're applying to grad programs, you might want to ask students in the department how the department supported them through COVID, because that's very telling. Because obviously COVID's not going anywhere, but more so than COVID, like something else could pop up. I mean, you could get sick or have I had to have surgery my second year of grad school, and like my advisor was super nice and everything. But I think I've seen a lot of my friends who are at institutions that are in states that actually believe that COVID is happening, working a lot more from home. I live in Florida, which, as you can see in the news, doesn't have COVID. We don't believe in it here. So there's been a big push to like everyone come back and work in person. So just something to consider, like talking to the programs about how they've handled COVID and how flexible they are about supporting their students can be really telling.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So we can have the break if you would like to for 5 minutes, and then we can answer the question that recently popped up on our chat. So we can have the break right now because we're writing schedule. So we'll see you in 5 minutes. think that we're almost ready. So since the group is fairly small, the breakout rooms might just be of one person with one person. So we just like to discuss the topics broadly here since the group, is fairly small. Yeah, okay, that sounds great. So I think that before that we cover a little bit of the topics from the breakout rooms, we'll go over two questions from the chat. And the first one is, did any of you start your graduate degree in a cohort of other students? Was that important for you?
So I got offered to stay a little bit longer at the place where I was working with the USGS, and I deferred to the spring semester, which meant I lost my cohort, but that was not a big deal for me. And actually, the other person that was joining the same lab that I was joining had also deferred for the spring. So we had our own little, and there was one other person in the department that did the same thing. So our own little 3-person cohort. Like I've also seen other people, like other cohorts in our department start together. And they're like pretty tight and they help each other and they study together because they're taking the same classes. I think it just depends on what you want and what you like. Like for me, it was not a big deal. I think I'm more of a me and my own thing kind of person. So I was fine. And then I also, but I'll say I did get to interact a lot with the other grad students in my department. So I was part of different committees and like our student association, et cetera. So I found other ways in which I could, feel that community, but I didn't have a cohort per se.
Terry forgot to mention that in our master's, we started one semester apart. And so we were in a rather small department at a smaller university. It's not an R1 university. And so I think even in our whole department, usually there was around maybe 24 people in a grade level or in a cohort. And so even our lab had like 6 or 7 grad students, which is kind of big. So even that kind of was like my own cohort or whatever, because a master's degree is only 2 years. So you're kind of at the same place. Whereas when you go into your PhD, there's can be quite a bit of difference from where you're at life space or even educational space between a 5th year student or even a 6th year student and a 1st year student. And I started with a cohort. My cohort was like 14 people. And in my first semester, it was very helpful trying to navigate like the buildings and what to do. But I like Terry, like the autonomy and are self-driven as you have to be as a graduate student to some extent. So I didn't necessarily rely on my cohort, but I do think it's really important to interact with your peers because they're going to become your collaborators one day. So there are at my university groups like the bird group or the fungal group that are close, that meet up and read papers together, have some kind of discussion. And it's important to kind of get to know those people because you might want to write a grant with them, or they may assist you with some bioinformatic help or whatever in the future. So not necessarily a cohort as in starting at the same time, but it is important to build your team in grad school.
I didn't necessarily have a cohort either. Like we had this seminar class in my department, and so we kind of knew who all came in at like the same time and then who came in like the semester before. So like it was nice just because like especially as an international student, you kind of don't really have that like community yet. So you kind of rely on like people who start on the same time as you just because like you feel that emptiness together. But kind of like now where I'm at is kind of just I've branched out a bit more just because I've moved a lot growing up, so it's kind of nothing new. So yeah, I'm kind of like the same as Paris and Terry, as there wasn't really much of a cohort and didn't really need it so much.
Yeah, I came in with a cohort it was, I think about 16 people started when I started, a mix of master's and PhD students. And my cohort I was super close to, especially when we were all taking classes together, because we would study together for exams, and like it was also a big social component. But I also was in a lab that was very close, and we would hang out and do things and like, you know, go out for forays or go hiking or whatever. So I also had like a very good community. But I would say now, like, I still have 2 or 3 really close friends from that cohort that are so much more of like my emotional support system, which is super important. Definitely build a good like emotional social support system, as well as networking for collaborators. Like, I'm a mycologist in a plant pathology department, so a lot of my cohorts are plant pathologists, so maybe the collaboration element isn't quite, you know, the research interests don't overlap, but they're like my best friends who, you know, we text and support each other. So that's super important.
Jeff, do you have something to share?
I mean, I don't have too much to add. I think that depending on the university, they may have a class you take, which is like how to succeed in graduate school. Or even if there's not a class like that, there'll probably be a freshman seminar that most incoming students will take. So whether there's a formal or informal way to meet everyone, it will happen. But just echoing what Elena was saying, it's good to have emotional support, and it's good to have, you know, friends or connections, you know, outside of that immediate group too, because what can happen when you get in graduate school is you spend all of your time in the lab and in your department. And if you can't have any any exposure to people outside of your lab or department, even when you're supposed to be having fun in the social life, you know, inevitably work will come up, and that's not, you know, full relaxation. So if you can, you know, have a few opportunities where you can forget about lab and, you know, everyone that's there, that can be useful just for your mental health. But definitely having good connections in the lab is useful as well.
Awesome, thank you. I will just probably add up to that at least when I was trying to decide which program I wanted to like go, when I was doing the interviews, I noticed like how the different members of the potential cohort would be like, and at least in my experience, I felt that at the different programs that I were like, one of them felt like I would be just okay with the people that were going to be part of my cohort, but I didn't feel that I had a connection with the students that potentially would also be part of the cohort with me. And I think that that's something that you may want to consider when you're in the interview process, to see like, okay, do I feel that I'll be like a good fit into this group of people that they might not be part of the lab, but they're still are going to somehow be involved with me and the community that I built in the program. So the other question that we had is, I've heard mixed feedback about going for a master's and then a PhD versus going right into a PhD program. Do you have, do any of you have experiences or advice you'd care to share on the topic?
I think for me, as someone who got his master's and then went to a PhD program, I think that was the right path for me, but it really depends from person to person. So at the time where I started my master's program, I knew I wanted some kind of career in the environmental sciences, doing conservation work, perhaps doing mycology work. I didn't have this overarching goal of I want to be, you know, a professor, or I want to be or have this position that requires a PhD. So it wouldn't have been smart for me to go towards that degree then. But if you know that's what you want and you feel pretty strongly about it, and perhaps you want to save a year or two, that is definitely an option. It might be good to have some work experience or some other background that makes your application more competitive, or really shows people that you are passionate about the topic.
I also got my master's before my PhD, and I know Jeff and Terry both took a break to go into the workforce. I went straight back to back master's and PhD, so I've been in higher education. I think this is my 11th or 12th year, and there are definitely times, not gonna lie, and I'm sure all of us feel this way, that you're exhausted or you're tired, or maybe you question whether this was the right path, because it's a long time to be studying and to be learning, and not feel like maybe you have your career or your place that you call home in the future or whatever. So those are things to consider, but that's like a con in that, it's a long road to do your master's. That potentially is 2 to 3 extra years you tacked on if you're going to do your PhD in 5, and some people do it in 6 or 7. Those are things to acknowledge. And so it can be a long road. And sometimes it's good to, take a break and decide what you really want to do. But additionally, having a master's or having some career experience can really help you speed along that PhD, and make it a smoother ride. Because a PhD is writing heavy. You're expected usually to do multiple chapters, and having done a thesis and then also publishing that manuscript has been unequivocally the best skill that I learned before going to my PhD. And writing is something I feel very comfortable with now. And I would consider myself generally a prolific writer, as in I have almost 10 publications now in my PhD, which is pretty advanced, but it's because I had that stepping stone of having my master's and breaking everything down in the writing process and going through 47 drafts before I was able to publish a manuscript. And that's not an exaggeration. And so there's like pros and cons to both of them. And I think, like I said, you might want to cut time by going straight to your PhD, but also some of those skills that you learn in your master's can cut down the time in your PhD. And so I know Elena also went straight to her PhD, so maybe she can talk on that as well.
Yeah, so I went to a small liberal arts school. So I had lab experience because we didn't have PhD students. Like if you wanted to work in a lab, the undergrads were, the option. So I had a lot of lab experience, and I wrote an honors thesis, and my university emphasized writing a lot. So I felt like I had kind of come out of undergrad with really good skills. I knew I wanted to take time off. I came from a pretty rigorous undergraduate degree. So I wanted to take some time off, learn some new skills. I went to a lab that was, I learned a lot of molecular skills as a technician. So I had advisors at Smith at my undergrad that were like, well, if the end goal is the PhD, like you might as well just go directly into the PhD. And so I kind of had that in mind. And I think when I started my PhD, to be very honest, like I definitely think I struggled a lot with confidence. I don't know if having a master's would have like cured me of that imposter syndrome, but I definitely think that like the first 2 years, I just felt like I don't have any publications. I don't have anything to show that I know what I'm doing. And like, I definitely kind of floundered a little bit in terms of my own self-confidence, which, wasn't a master's or not problem, but was just something that I struggled with. And my advisor also doesn't have a master's. So he's always like, don't worry about it. Like, you're going to do great, But I think it's something that if having the master's, like Paris said, like it gave her opportunities to build those skills and maybe get a little bit more confident, so that by the time you step into the PhD role where you feel a lot of pressure to like perform, you have those skills going in. That was my personal experience.
I think I'm just completely different from everyone else, but that's okay. So yeah, I kind of went back to back between undergrad, pharmacy school, and then now the PhD program. So yeah, I'm in like grade 10 now with all that time. I don't think a master would have really helped me so much, because there's definitely skill sets that I have learned in pharmacy school that definitely helped out with at least like getting into the PhD program. Writing is just out the window. I'm definitely having to learn that from scratch, but definitely in terms of like understanding how to think like a researcher, I think I was able to own that skill a bit more, at least during pharmacy school, because whenever I wasn't taking classes, I was in the lab. And luckily, like my last year was just doing rotations. So I was at like different pharmacy sites, just gaining experience. But then I kind of knew like, yeah, there was nothing like research would have cured. So yeah, that's kind of my experience.
Yeah, so I also did a master's before I did my PhD, and I'm a strong supporter of masters before you go for a PhD. I think it has a lot of benefits. One of them is it's just 2 years. You get to see if this is what you like doing. If not, then you're done. Maybe you decide along the way, like, oh, you know, like I actually like this other thing better. Or I changed my mind. I now realize that what I want to work at or the job that I want to do doesn't require a PhD. So I can go with my master's. Like Paris was saying, I think it just gives you so many opportunities to like have more publications by the time you're done with your PhD. Like I have 6, 7 publications for my master's, and then I'm gonna have whatever I'm gonna have at the end of my PhD, rather than just 4 to 5 years of time to get manuscripts out, just with a PhD. So I see an advantage there. It also gives you, you know, the opportunity to work with more different like teams of people, have different types of bosses or like advisors. You get to network more, attend more conferences while they're paid for you through your programs. Yeah, the thing is, I only see a lot of benefits to it. And the things that might be like, oh, but you know, you could save 2 years. I'm like, well, in my case, I'm not in a rush to be done. I'll be done whenever I'm done. And, you know, it might vary by person. You might be on a timeline and you need to get it done. So that might weigh in your decision. And I've also know a few people, and this is a biased sampling because it's just like 3 people that have gone directly through their PhD programs, and they have struggled a lot in the beginning. Just like Elena was saying, just having that experience through your master's or in other labs, if you're an undergrad, if you have a lot of lab experience, that can help you better start your PhD program. I feel like there was something else I was going to mention, but I forgot.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would definitely, if I could go back in time, I think I would do my master's first. I think also being a little bit older helps. I always feel like the young like baby in the group, because a lot of my lab mates and cohorts are like in their 30s and I'm 26. So I feel very young, which shouldn't matter, but it can at times. So I would recommend the master's in hindsight.
I thought of one thing to bridge the gap. One of the things you should look for when you're looking at programs is, do they have a master's in route program? I talked earlier about non-thesis route and master's, but also there's such a thing as master's in route. And I know the University of New Mexico, the one that I'm at, has this, and you can enter in your master's program, get a master's, and you should look at, can you easily transition to staying for a PhD? Or can you apply for the PhD program and get a master's en route? So this is when you take your qualifying exams, usually after 2 to 3 years, depending on the program and depending on the coursework requirements. They will have you write maybe a dissertation proposal where you outline your project, or say maybe your preliminary data that you've collected, and they will give you a master's en route to your PhD. And at that point, then you can kind of reassess, like Terry said, if this is the stopping point for you, then at least you're not walking away from your PhD program with nothing. You could be walking away with a master's. And that's why I also, support getting a master's, is because you can make those decisions about where you want to go in your career, or do you want to continue doing this kind of thing after having a couple of years of experience in higher education and more research focused field? But yeah, you should look in to see if there's such a thing as master's en route in the program you're looking at, because I think that's a great thing that you should get. And then if there's a life event, or if you change your mind, like that allows you a nice spot to pause or come back or whatever.
Awesome. That's great advice. Thank you. Okay, so we'll just go over some of the topics from the breakout rooms. I think that we've discussed a lot about the paths to graduate school. Do you have anything else to say about paths to graduate school? You're good? Okay. So
Well, I don't know.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I thought that someone might have brought up funding before. I don't know if we really talked too much about that.
Not really, but if you want to discuss it, go ahead. like I know, like, you know, how do graduate schools, you know, fund themselves, but some people might not know. So how do actually like grad students fund, you know, grad school?
Yeah, I was thinking of this when thinking of applying to grad school, kind of in the same realm. Do you want to take it away, Jeff, first?
No, you can go ahead.
So one thing to consider if you're going to do your master's is that it does take 2 years, and the GRFP, which is the, oh man, I didn't get it, so it's hard to remember the acronym, Graduate Fellowship Research Program, correct me if I'm wrong, something like that, Graduate Research Fellowship Program. It's in the States, money you can apply for through the National Science Foundation that can fund you during graduate school. And I believe the eligibility period is you can only apply in your first or second years. So what that means for, I believe so. What that means is you might have to consider your timeline and what program, what research questions you're going to want to do, because I realized that I was ineligible for applying to that program way later in my PhD career. But we did talk about earlier TA-ships versus RA-ships versus GA-ships. And when you apply to a program, they should also give you a contract. And that should tell you what kind of working obligations they want you to do or will provide, that will give you your classes paid for, your health insurance paid for, and then what kind of stipend they're going to award you to fund school. And you should really check to see, does that include summer funding? Does that include dental or eye care? Is that enough for the area you're living in to get by with your rent check? Does that guarantee 5 years, or do they only guarantee 3 years and they expect you to come up with 2 other years of funding? Those are important things to pay attention to in your contract.
I would say also, as an international student, most of your stipend will be coming from your prof's grant. Luckily at my school, they kind of alleviate some of that with the Faculty of Graduate Studies kind of matching the 1-to-1 ratio of how much my prof is paying for my stipend. But at least like whenever we were kind of like talking about my stipend in the beginning, we were like, okay, like this much is going to be from the research and then this much is going to be coming from TAing. So at least I knew in advance like what I was getting myself into. But also I would say look into your institutional funding. I know at my university, there's like a graduate fellowship that students can apply to. Yeah, the eligibility criteria is pretty strict, also kind of like the GRFP that the NSF has. But also kind of a fun fact, if you're kind of looking more into the medical area, the NIH does offer fellowships if you are studying outside the US in one of their kind of like approved institutions. So I'm kind of in the process of applying for that. It's kind of been a while due to circumstances, but luckily there's no like hardcore eligibility criteria on that. So just something to note.
I would just keep in mind that unless you get very fortunate with like some nice fellowships and scholarships, you probably won't be saving any or much money during grad school. Usually most people can, live okay with their assistantships, but I would keep that in mind. And if you are looking at programs that are in really high cost of living areas, I would take that into account, unless you're planning to pay for housing out of savings or something like that, because some of the assistantships, I think it varies, but for example, here in Indiana, the cost of living is really low. And I can't think off the top of my head, but I think it's around 22,000 a year is something like that, which is pretty fine here for housing. But even if it's a lot higher of a salary in certain cities, you should consider that as well.
Yeah, and these are topics that you can ask when you go visit the universities for your interviews. There'll be, opportunities when you're like just meeting with the grad students in the program. So you can ask this type of questions like, how much in average do you get paid? Like, how is the cost of living around here? Is it easy to rent? To make those decisions between schools once you get offers. Something else that I think it's important and not everyone knows before they make their decisions is that to make sure that you have summer funding. Sometimes programs will say, oh, you're covered, for the year. The year means fall and spring, and then you're on your own for the summer. So make sure you ask about that too.
And also ask about student fees, how much if your department requires student fees and how much those are, because some programs will cover them, so you don't have to pay them, but some are quite high. Like at UF, it's about it ends up being about $2,000 a year that is coming out of our pocket. Yeah, just ridiculous. So you should know that, and also funding for I think Jeff brought up a really great point that sometimes you have funding for what appears to be 5 years, but then it's actually only 3. So definitely clarify how many years, and then kind of ask around, if you need more time than the average amount of, most programs, it's oh, most of our students do it in 4 years or 5 years. Ask about what funding opportunities there are if you need to extend a semester or a year, because that can also help. You never know how long it'll take you to finish. So
I would also add that you can also advocate for an increase in your stipend. So I know at least in my university, we haven't increased the stipends in forever, but yet cost of living increased, and the international healthcare got kicked off of different from everyone else. So we had to pay out of our own pockets. So we kind of went up to our graduate head and was like, hey, we're having to pay for a lot. And the tuition just increased $500 in the summer. How are you expecting us to budget this? And so after enough of us actually went up to the graduate head, the department actually had a meeting. Was like, okay, we'll increase it by $2,000 just because we're things have changed since they've last revisited the stipend.
Yeah, usually your stipend doesn't change. What you get at the beginning is the same, even though the cost of living goes up. I think some schools give a little raise after the quals. Mine doesn't, but I've heard some people who get a $1,000 raise once they become a candidate. Maybe that's only, I don't know. Didn't happen for me. So that's hard too. Whatever you start with, 4, 5, 6 years later, rent goes up every year, and it can get tough. Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't know this before, but not all grad students across departments get paid the same. And the universities usually have a pay grade that is posted, and you can check at any time. So maybe what you could do is just check with those departments what the grade for their assistants is. So you can go and check online exactly how much they get paid.
The biology department is one of the best paid departments at our university. But I was able, when I had gotten my offer, to leverage another PhD school offer. And there was a huge price difference between $32,000 and $22,000. it was also taking into account cost of living at those two schools, but my advisor was able to promise summer salary, which I know Terry brought up is so important because you don't realize what it's like to not have pay for 2 months. And so, you know, he was able to say that, and not only do they need to say it, they need to put it into your contract. Because when my advisor forgets it in April, and I say, oh, hey, this is my contract and I have summer funding and this is the price you said you'd pay. And then it's their responsibility to come up with that money. But that's so important to have. Yeah, so advocate for yourself because we don't do it enough.
Yes, I would agree for advocating. My PI accidentally forgot to renew my stipend. And so I wasn't paid for like 3 pay cycles, which is about 6 weeks. But yeah, I was like constantly going after them as like, hey, when is this going to come? When is this going to come? So, I mean, don't be afraid to hunt what's yours.
That is great advice. Thank you very much. I think that we are almost running out of time, and one of the topics that I would like to include in the conversation is the importance of mental health, not only in grad school, but also during the application of, you know, applying to grad school. So do you have any comments about, you know, how important mental health has been for you, not only at grad school, but also during the whole process of applying to get in?
I guess I'll go. I've been on a personal mental health journey since applying for my PhD. There's just stuff that was going on during my PharmD that kind of made mental health a little bit difficult to look after. But for me, at least applying during the process, it was kind of like that glimmer of hope of like, yes, I can go somewhere different and kind of start anew. And luckily I have like this great supervisor who's just like, you know, hey, I'm going to take a whole week off for my mental health, or like, hey, I'm going to take a whole week off for vacation. He's just like, do it. And like, even if we have anything like personal, family wise, that like we have to go back to like our countries, I have like other lab mates from other countries that like he's very supportive of like, you know, us taking care of ourselves and like dealing with what's important with us versus just saying, oh, your PhD comes first.
Yeah, definitely talk to the other students in the lab if you can, one-on-one. And I would recommend also reaching out to like recently graduated students from the lab, because you're more likely to get a very honest picture about the supervisor and whether what you see is what you get, and how supportive they are about things like mental health or visiting family or just expectations as a grad student. I think it's really important to make the time in grad school to like do things that you enjoy, whether that's exercising, hanging with friends, you know, like doing other things so that your whole entire life isn't grad school, because it's very easy to get very consumed. And like, you're still a human being, like you should enjoy things in life, you know, beyond grad school. So.
Yeah, I think what Elena said is really true. It's important to talk with other people first, and also just keep in mind, you know, you're going to be where you're going to be for a long time, you know, 4+ years. So if you're considering programs and you feel like a location or the people you've chatted with, you're going to get along with better, whereas one, you know, you might be more familiar with the research, I would just really consider that, especially if you're maybe a member of a minority group that's not going to be comfortable in a certain country, or you visited, you know, a city in America before and you feel like you're just not going to feel at home there. Like, I would definitely keep that in mind where you're choosing where you're going to live for the next 5-ish years of your life.
Yeah, I will say grad school is not easy. There are a lot of things that come into play, and it can be very hard. So and there's like this, culture that has been perpetuated that you're supposed to always be productive and always be in the lab and be in the lab until 2 a.m. and then go back at 4 a.m. And no, I think Elena mentioned this, like make time for yourself and to be healthy. The healthier you are, the better your PhD is going to go. Just as simple as that. And then something that I would recommend when you're interviewing and looking at schools is to check what mental health resources they have. It's so important. And so many of us need, a little bit more support. And if those things are available to us and are provided by the university, that's a lot better than if you have to pay for them out of pocket. So that's something that you can look into while you're looking into schools.
That's great advice, Terry. And I was thinking about, the struggles of grad school, and it sounds like a lot of us have very supportive advisors, but I've also talked to students and I've had friends who've had struggles with their advisor-student relationship. And just remember along the way, you're starting to build that team I talked about earlier. So you might have other people who are on your committee, either for a master's or for a PhD, that can help you navigate that. Or maybe you're talking to like senior students who can help you navigate things that are going on in the program. But I mean, with COVID happening, a lot of people got a wrench thrown in their research, whether they couldn't attend field sites or collect data, or they couldn't use some of the tools that were supposed to be the facilities that you have on campus. And so taking care of your mental health really does lead you to be more productive. In my spare time, I've played roller derby and rugby throughout my graduate school career because I really like working out, and that releases a lot of endorphins for me. So make sure you find something that even though it takes up some time, it's you time, and that you can step away. I think Jeff said this too, step away from science and truly relax, whether it's reading a nice book or it's going to go work out or whatever it is for you. And then also, on top of all this, we're managing our human relationships. So you have, friendship drama or relationship drama. I'm getting married, and that's a whole nother stressor that you're navigating through these times as well. So like Terry said, sometimes there are these unrealistic expectations put on grad students. A master's does not have to take 2 years. A PhD does not have to take 5 years. It is okay to take a break. It is okay to leave what you're doing. It's okay to switch advisors. It's okay that your project fails and that you switch projects completely. Those are all things that are okay, that your fellow peers are going through and doing it as well. And the best thing you can do for yourself is get, support, whether it needs to be professional support or it's, friends providing you emotional support, whatever it is, take care of yourself. And so important.
I would kind of also harp on COVID-19 just because I'm stuck at home mostly now. Is kind of, like see what your program has done for their grad students during the lockdown. I know at least for like my program, like all students still continued their funding, even though we were all stuck at home. So yeah, like just kind of like see where like how bad COVID's affecting the area and like kind of ask them, hey, what are you doing for your grad students? And kind of ask those important questions, because I feel like especially for first gen, you don't really know what kind of questions to ask.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We're a minute out of 5:30 here, but I was wondering, just the last question. I don't know, do you have like a suggestion, a tip, a comment, a final one that if you could go back to in time, would you tell yourself like, just remember this, what would be that?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I had it.
Yeah, sure. So if you could go back in time, like when you started, now that you've experienced what you've experienced so far, what would you tell like yourself, like if you could go back in time?
I think it's for me, like being able to have that like hominess or like, that community feeling. Cause yeah, you can be passionate about your research, but at the end of the day, like you can't keep on being a go-getter. You have to take like you have to rest. So that would be the one advice to myself.
I would tell myself water off a duck's back. If you've ever heard that saying, that's being able to let things go when things like stress and compile up. And I have a really type A personality, and I've never had the problem with confidence or advocating for myself. And I've had to do it plenty of times during my graduate career. But sometimes you just have to let things go, choose your battle, and like let some of those stressors just water off a duck's back and move on and move forward with the situation that you're given.
Those are great pieces of advice. I would just say, similar to Susan, balance is important. So even if you want to spend all your time doing work, you want to focus on that, your work will be higher quality and you will be more productive and happier if you take time to find some time for yourself as well.
I think I learned a lot of things through my master's that I brought into then what I learned from it into my PhD. But I guess something that I have learned through my PhD is that everything is going to be okay. There's so many things that are gonna go wrong. Like we had issues with the permits for collecting, and all my samples from this field system got detained. Then my fieldwork has been delayed for 1.5 years now. So, like you spend time stressed out about like all of those different things that just seem to keep going wrong in what you're doing. But in the end, everything is gonna work out and everything's gonna be fine. Because you're there for a reason. You've made it there because you have the capability to be there. So yeah, just keep calm.
I think maybe just focus on your own success. It can be really easy to compare yourself to others, or like how far along are you in your program compared to someone who's working on a different project. It's really, really hard. It's still something I'm working on, but I think just kind of keeping an eye on like, what are you doing? What is your project? Like, where are you at? Kind of just focusing on your own success, because it's very easy to like start comparing yourself to others and how far along they are. And like people always say everyone's on their own journey, but like truly everyone is on a very different path. So focus on your own.
Yeah, and that's part of the beautiful thing about grad school, that there are a bunch of different paths, and they have their own special thing. So our time is up, but I would like to thank the panelists for joining us. It was, great to have this conversation, and the attendees, thank you for asking questions and being engaged. It was, a really nice event, and I'm really excited that it happened. So thank you very much, and hopefully, we'll be able to meet you in the next MSA or in other events. Awesome. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.